Hello, everybody, and welcome to Philosophising In, the podcast about philosophy in lesser studied languages. Today, we have a very happy announcement in that we will be doing our first in-person recording and also our first recording with two guest speakers. We're here at the University of Warsaw with
Jakub Wolak from the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology
and
of the Polish Academy of Sciences.
And Tomasz Herbich from the University of Warsaw.
Excellent. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak with us today and for hosting us. I wanted to get straight in with a question about the origin of philosophy in Polish lands, maybe rather than the Polish language initially. What are the earliest works of philosophy that are published in the Polish language, and what comes before?
The earliest works of philosophy published in Polish language, I think it's a quite contentious issue. Well, with Polish language as such starts to be language of high literature and lay literature, perhaps in 16th century. Earlier on, we have naturally religious literature, mostly chants and prayer books, etc. And the first lay book is printed in 1522, and these are Aesop's Fables and Aesop's Vita by a translation of Aesop's Fable, an original Vita wrote by Bernard of Lublin, also known as Bernardus of Lublin, who was a very interesting personality, a humanist physician, also interested in Neoplatonist medicine and Neoplatonist philosophy of nature, reportedly with some links to the circles of Ficino, but still these are just fables. And philosophy is published and written mostly in Latin by then, and these are quite interesting works. Poland was particularly well known for its contribution to natural sciences and natural philosophy. Copernicus is the most remarkable figure naturally, but whole milieu of the Academy of Krakow is a great cluster of natural philosophy in the 15th century particularly, and also Polish legal theorists are widely recognized for their contributions to theories of just war, international law, but still this is all Latin. Polish language literature, or old Polish language literature, starts to develop quickly from the first half of the 16th century onwards, and these are mostly humanist works and very often political literature. And philosophy, it is difficult to say when does philosophy proper in Polish language begins, since in the 16th century there is a great deal of interesting works which are on the intersection of political theory and philosophy, for instance. So, and basically no or little strictly metaphysical works. So one could point at the 16th century, like the 1560s, and authors such as Stanisław Orzechowski, or in terms of Polish language, political writing in the mid-16th century, mostly him. But when you want like philosophy in the Polish language, understood technically, perhaps the so-called founding figure in terms of also conceptuality would be one Sebastian Petrycy z Pilzna, or Sebastian Petrycy of Pilzno, who published Polish translations of Aristotle's so-called practical works, that is economics, politics, and ethics, as far as I'm concerned, at the beginning of the 17th century. And these are not merely translations, but these are heavily annotated and commented translations with so-called przydatki or addenda, so that he published very long commentaries which are exclusively in Polish. And it's a novum, because earlier on this kind of scholarship would be reserved for Latin, and now you have an attempt to translate it into Polish and to explain it in Polish, so that he's building Polish philosophical vocabulary.
And is this a Polish which would be easily understandable to a contemporary reader, or is this a very different stuff?
I think that it's in the midway, so that it's not a totally different language. It's the Old Polish, or as the historians of language would have it, Middle Polish. These are different terminologies for the history of language and for the history of culture, which is not widely known actually even in Poland. But well, it's basically the elder stage of the development of current language. So it's a continuum, but still you would need to have some experience of reading this to get everything in order.
Yes.
So this is not accessible without instruction or experience, although it is comprehensible, but you can also there are many false threads, for instance.
Sure.
Yes, and when you are a common user of a language, yes, I think, of Polish language, contemporary common user, of course, when you deal with such a text, you can, I think, easily get a main idea of the text, but in fact, in case of different singular matters, yes, that constitutes this text, it is much more difficult to get the very meaning, for example, of a single word. Yes, so this is in fact that's such a situation that it is a continuity, but a continuity, of course, with different dimensions and differences. Yes,
sure. So maybe if we were, as modern readers, to be able to understand it, we would need a commentary on the commentary on the commentary.
Yes, of course, and it is very interesting that contemporary we have got an attempt to retranslate into modern Polish some texts, for example, by Kochanowski. And it is very interesting discussion, by Antoni Libera.
Yes,
and it is very interesting discussion about whether we should do this or we should not do this. Yes, because I think that you can say more about this than me. But it is very interesting because on the one hand, we can get main ideas of Kochanowski just by reading his text. By on the other hand, we do not have such a comprehensive, multi-dimensional attitude toward the text of Kochanowski in the language in which it was originally written. Yes.
But I guess that you are meaning you are speaking of Antoni Libera's translation of Odprawa posłów greckich, or the Dispatch of the Greek Envoys, which is the most important Old Polish tragedy. Very, very interesting text in Bleak verse, quite short, and wonderful, wonderful Old Polish poetry, but not very intuitively accessible to contemporary Polish speakers. Very difficult to set on stage. So Libera, who is a very acknowledged translator and poet and novelist, prepared a translation to contemporary Polish to set it on stage, and it was a huge success. Because if you would set it on stage in Old Polish, the public wouldn't get that much of it. Although, if you know Old Polish, I think that it is way more enjoyable in the original, if you have some understanding of it. But
Interesting.
Very difficult for broader public.
So to turn from the translation of Polish into Polish and to go back to the original translation of the Greek into Polish, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about maybe a couple of examples of terms and how they're translated from Aristotle into contemporary Polish. So are terms borrowed and taken over? You know, in English, for example, we simply take over ethics, politics, hylomorphism, and things like that, rather than coining new terms as you get in the translation of Greek philosophy and other languages. Do these early Polish translators like to coin new Polish terms, or is there a sort of borrowing of Latin and Greek?
Well, if you mean really basic concepts such as ethics, politics, these are generally borrowed because they are already widespread. But if you mean technical concepts of Aristotle and versus ethics, they are Patrycy and most of people interested in would think of Polish words which have similar meaning. Because if these were just borrowings, it wouldn't be that difficult because borrowings persist in language because they're they're not part of the natural texture of the language, so to say, so they're less prone to mutations, like semantic mutations. And I think that Patrycy's one of Patrycy's aims was simply to translate Aristotelian practical philosophy into early modern Polish reality, so that he wasn't aiming for purely academic and technical public, yes, but also for broader public. And that's why he would rather use coinages, because, for instance, his economics was a book about running a household. I mean, Aristotelian economics. So I guess that's what he was up to, because it was not a purely academic enterprise. Also, there's an important division between languages, as early modern Poland, well into late 17th, or even 18th society, was basically a bilingual society in terms of the nobles, of people with civic rights. So they would speak both Polish and quite good or sometimes magnificent Latin. And these languages would be used for different purposes. So Latin would be language of natural philosophy and whole disciplined philosophy, universities, and also, of course, mass and theological issues, plus some genres of literature, but not all, but particularly those which emulate ancient literature, while Polish would also be naturally used widely in literature, but Polish, from some point on, would be a dominant language of political discourse and political works and treaties. And then you have two linguistic universes which coexist, which involve often the same actors, but are used for different reasons. And with kind of a passage or transition of Aristotelian translation of Aristotelian tradition from Neo-Latin to Polish, done by Petrycy, with this transition, Petrycy shows that he intends to address his translations to another public and to another sphere of literary matters.
So at what stage do we start to get, let's say, original compositions, things which are not simply translations of earlier Greek works? What would be the first original works of philosophy in Polish?
Oh, it's quite
very difficult question.
It's a very difficult question, yes, because in fact, I think that in the history of Polish philosophy, a crucial moment in which Poles started to really think in Polish language and not only in Polish language as translated from the Latin language, yes, by using different categories taken from Latin, but of course repragmatized in Polish language. It is this moment in which we start to think in Polish language is probably the turn of Enlightenment and Romanticism. Okay. But in fact, it is as you see, it is not obvious whether we should start with Enlightenment philosophers, philosophers of Enlightenment, or we should start with the philosophers of early Romanticism, because in fact these two realities coexist in the same moment, philosophical moment. At the beginning of 19th century, the main representatives of Polish Enlightenment wrote main philosophical works of this period in the development of Polish philosophy and culture. And this is very important because of the fact that when we compare it with the chronology of this moment, of this epoch in other European countries, it is of course very late. Yes, it is only the beginning of 19th century, the first 2 or 3 decades of 19th century, and in the same moment, at the same time, there were constructed the first early works of Polish Romanticism, not only in poetry but also, of course, in philosophy or aesthetics. So we can see that we can link directly this moment to the beginning of the 19th century, first 3 decades of the 19th century, but we can, of course, doubt whether it started with Enlightenment, with the philosophers of Enlightenment of that time, or whether we should think that it started with this first early attempt to construct philosophy of Polish Romanticism.
Yeah, sure. Could you provide a little bit of background for our listeners about why this may have developed?
Yeah, but I would cut in for a second and say that it is quite contentious issue, because this is all up to what are you willing to include as philosophy.
Yes, of course.
We often an issue we often discuss, and I think that Tomasz means conceptual tradition of more or less systematic, speculative thought,
in the
speculative thought.
Sure.
Written in one language and with concepts enduring over decades. Was earlier on, in early modern period, from 16th to late 18th century, you have this bilingualism, and you didn't have this this level of speculation. In fact, like the early modern Polish nobles were not highly interested in speculation, perhaps in theological speculation mostly, but were definitely interested in so-called practical philosophy, to invoke Aristotelian terms, namely in politics and ethics. But also wrote works which I would dub works of philosophy in Polish language, like political dialogues of Stanisław Orzechowski from the 1560s, which are like emulating Platonic dialogues. But this is not definitely not a tradition of speculative thought. So that's basically where the point of departure, or like the starting point of the history of philosophy of Polish languages, is varying
based on what one's criteria for properly philosophical.
So you can either start it in the middle of the 16th century or at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries.
It is a good question, and yes, it is just as Jakub said. And also, when we are referring to the Enlightenment, a very important moment, I think, was the moment in which it is a political moment in which the Latin handbooks were excluded by the Commission of National Education in 1773. Yes, I probably remember.
I think so.
In 1773. So it was this moment when the Latin handbooks were excluded from the national education. Yes, and it's of course an important moment because we can see that already these representatives of Polish Enlightenment made an attempt to reconstruct this process of national education into Polish. Yes, and they of course excluded Latin from this national education.
Interesting. So there is a very specific point where this kind of philosophical bilingualism, which we could think of as characteristic of the earlier period, ends, and the new one comes in. Makes periodization very nice and easy.
Yes.
Excellent.
I think that's a good point, because language is quite determinant of like conceptual sphere, and this is precisely this period which Tomasz mentioned. Not only like the date, but the period. So the so-called Polish Stanisław Enlightenment, the reign of Stanisław August Poniatowski, where you have a rush towards fostering language in the Polish culture, as opposed in some extent to old Latin culture.
Could you explain a little bit of the political background of why that was deemed necessary, of why there was this sort of assertion of the Polish language as an essential medium as opposed to...
You see, in fact, the main and the most important political circumstances of this early 19th century philosophy should be directly linked to the moment of the loss of independence in 1795. And in fact, we can see there is a very interesting, from our point of view, text written by Jan Nepomucen-Kamiński. Jan Nepomucen-Kamiński was a very important representative of Polish late Enlightenment, who, for example, influenced very strongly the development of Polish theater. But he also wrote two texts. The first of it both have got a very interesting titles. The first has got a title that is a question, and this question is our language a philosophical one? And of course, in this text, Jan Nepomucen-Kamiński, and it was a very important text, although it was written by a representative of this Polish late Enlightenment culture, it was very important for Polish Romanticism. In this text, Jan Nepomucen-Kamiński first starts with a kind of a presupposition that there will be something like a Polish philosophy only if Polish language is a philosophical one. Only if we can point out in Polish, in this language that we use of common user, we can point some philosophical intuitions. If we don't have this, we can of course be philosophers that come from Poland, but we cannot be Polish philosophers. Thus, as for example, Hegel is not only a philosopher that comes from Germany, but he's a German philosopher who gets these intuitions that are already in the common language, and he tries to just put it on a higher level, to somehow elevate them to the higher level. And this is a very important question, and of course, Jan Nepomucen-Kamiński, and it is also one very important presupposition or assumption of very different Polish 19th and 20th century philosophers that tried to deal with this problem. He also presupposes that there is no important limit no important division between way we think and the way we speak, because we think in the same language in which we are speaking. Yes, and this is, we can be a philosophers, Polish philosophers, only if this language in which we not only speak but we also think have got these philosophical intuitions. It was very important for him to show that Polish language is a philosophical one and that we can construct an original philosophy on the basis of this language. So it is very important. But why, from the political point of view, because it was your question, why it should be done? It should be done, first of all, because of the fact that we cannot think of ourselves as of a kind of a collective subject that has got its own country. And it would be quite clear for Maurycy Mochnacki, for example, that we have to construct our own philosophy, our own national culture, to just still exist as a part of the historical reality, as a nation that does not have a state. According, of course, as you know, for example, to Hegel, the historical nations, that means these people, that the historical nations are only these people that construct their state. And as we don't have a state, according to Hegel, we are not we now at the beginning of 19th century, we are not a part of international relations, because in fact international relations are relations between states. And we do not play any role anymore in history. And for Polish philosophers of that time, it was very important to show that we still exist as a nation that has got its own specific original culture, literature, and which know itself through this culture and literature. Yes.
So the significance of demonstrating that Polish is indeed a philosophical language has a political valence, because it's demonstrating in some way the particular genius of the Polish people as a nation, of their particular forms of thought and speech.
Yes, and I think that it was the most important political precondition, something like this, which directly influenced this process of the development of Polish national philosophy. We just tried to think of ourselves as of being still a nation after the loss of the state. Yes, and to do it, we cannot think of ourselves only in terms of political nations, because political nations, or historical nations in the terminology of Hegel, are these nations that do have a state, but we didn't have it anymore.
Yes, Tomasz pointed that particularly at philosophy in the national language and like building cultural nation as addressed to the international community, but also it was, as far as I'm concerned, it was also an endeavor of reconstructing national community in the wake of the great shock of the partitions, because the partitions of Poland result in, so to say, mass depression, and also in simply socio-psychological sense that many people, or like culture, political culture was devastated, and there were I think there was a higher number of suicides. Like one national hero or national symbol who tried to stop signing the one of the treaties of the partitions, and simply threw himself before high officials entering the hall of the castle, perhaps. I guess it was in the castle. Later shot himself, and it's so it's a massive depression, which is kind of related, and could be read as like a local variation of the so-called Romantic depression. But in fact, what you have is a political culture and political nation which was not built on culture, although it had its own culture, but it was built on political practice, namely on participating in various assemblies, on executing laws, and on adherence to the monarch, breaking up. And this cultural effort which Tomasz mentioned, was also meant to reconstruct it, but to change it into a cultural nation, which would then be able to act politically. And we are here actually on a very special date, because we are here on the anniversary of the November Uprising, which started on November 29, not far from here, at Belvedere Palace, where Polish romantics were aimed at assassinating the governor, of the Kingdom of Poland,
the Russian governor,
the Russian governor, or simply the Prince Constantine, who was a younger brother of the Tsar. And this was a historical turning point of whole this project, since it was the most massive of the 19th century uprisings, and resulted in a huge exodus of the revolutionaries and intellectuals. So it was a project which was aimed at building a community, rebuilding the nation, which would be able to act politically as a cultural unit. And I think that it may have been described and reworked theoretically by no one else but an appraiser called Karol Liebelt.
Yes, of course.
I find this absolutely fascinating, the very high political ideals that come behind the attempt to claim the philosophical identity of a particular language. And I suppose it's not entirely dissimilar from one of the earliest attempts to translate philosophy and to demonstrate the philosophical nature of language, namely in Cicero. The attempt to say that, we Romans can philosophize too. Anything these Greeks can do, we can express in Latin just as well. And I was wondering what may be some of the insights that he does gain from the sort of analysis of the Polish language itself as being philosophical. What is his argument that Polish indeed does count as a philosophical language?
Of course, there are different ideas that are them, and he tried to show by Jan Nepomucen-Kamiński tried to show by different Polish words that, for example, it is combined of some elements that shows that something means something. For example, when we divide this word into the elements from which it is constructed, for example, yes, there are different etymological, linguistical combinations by which he tried to show that Polish language is of philosophical kind. But you see, in fact, when we are referring to this point and when we are speaking about this problem, we should first of all refer to Maurycy Mochnacki. And Maurycy Mochnacki was, first of all, one of the important initiator of the November Uprising, which was just mentioned by Jakub. But Maurycy Mochnacki was, first of all, this Polish philosopher, literary critic. Also, he was a critic of music, yes, a musician critic. He was this representative of Polish era Romanticism, who directly constructed the notion of the cultural nation on the basis of a kind of a philosophy. And he did it, first of all, by referring to the notion, to the German concept of Selbstbewusstsein. Selbstbewusstsein, of course, means something that is quite easy to translate into English, because if we know it is self-consciousness, but it was very difficult to translate it into Slavic languages, because we do not have any such concept that can clearly refer to different words that are in German philosophy. And the Selbstbewusstsein was not translated by Mochnacki in the way in which we translate it now, because in contemporary Polish language we translate it as samoświadomość, but it was first of all translated as in a very specific Polish formula. It is the formula mieć uznanie samego siebie w jestestwie swoim. In English we can translate it into something like to have a recognition of ourselves in our own existence, yes? But this notion, although it is quite difficult, I think that it is impossible to translate it directly into English.
Yes. It sounds Heideggerian a little.
Yes, it's Heideggerian very much, but it refers to something that was that can be expressed in a way in which also Mochnacki expressed it by Latin word, Latin formulas, because Mochnacki tried to refer also to Latin and to say that this Selbstbewusstsein is not only principium cogitandi, but it is principium cogitandi and descendi.
Yes.
It is the moment in which we know not only our thoughts, but also us as thinking, as the subject that thinks this thought. And it is very important because from this translation of Selbstbewusstsein into Polish, Mochnacki, and from so different philosophical concepts that can be linked to this Selbstbewusstsein, he gets his point. He tries to show that we became a subject that can exist also in history when we have got this knowledge of ourselves and as the one that became object for ourselves in our original literature and original culture. So we should get this knowledge of our culture as not only of this or that work of culture, yes, or text of culture, but we should get the knowledge of our literature, culture, philosophy as of these activities of a spirit, national spirit, in which this national spirit, national subject, thinks also of itself in this way of principium cogitandi et essendi.
Fantastic. That's wonderful to have a very nice specific example as well of one of the ways that they were doing these translations. So we have this strong emphasis on analyzing the Polish language for its philosophical resources, for the significance of working in the national language, the national culture, not only for its intellectual benefits, but also its political ones. But I also understand that later on during this period, it's a very significant sort of second stage in the translation of foreign works into Polish, namely, as you've initially been indicating, from German texts. You've already indicated one of the things I was going to ask, which was about particular difficulties in the translation of Germanic rather than Latinate or Greek into Polish. And I like the idea that you suggested that it was particularly at the points of difficulty of translation that it was sort of noting what was particularly distinctive and interesting about the Polish language. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the translation of German idealism into Polish, who conducted them, what their challenges and achievements were.
In fact, you should first of all refer at the beginning of 19th century, and I think that in the first half of 19th century, there were only a few translations from German, contemporary for those days, of course, recent for those days, philosophy into Polish. Yes, you see, in fact, Polish philosophers, Polish poets, different Polish intellectuals were all directly referring into German texts, first of all, and second of all, some of them also, especially these late representatives of Polish Enlightenment, who, for example, criticized Kant, they didn't know Kant from German because, for example, Stanisław Staszic didn't speak German, but they just knew it from some presentations given by other philosophers. But in fact, from that time we've got only a few translations, I think, and maybe these translations they are not done in a systematic way. Yes, for example, we have got a translation from that time of a part that is dedicated to Slavic people from Herder's work, for example. We have got a translation of the first initial lecture of Schelling in Berlin, which has been done, which was done shortly after Schelling have conducted this lecture. But in fact, we did not have a kind of a systematic work to translate, for example, German idealism into Polish language from the first half of the 19th century. These attempts, they clearly have begun in the second part of the 19th century. The most important for me moment and the most important phenomenon in this process of translating of German modern and contemporary philosophy into Polish, and the greatest phenomenon of this kind was especially or particularly this phenomenon when Polish poets of Young Poland, that means at the beginning of the 20th century, translated in a very short period of time main works by Nietzsche, published by Nietzsche's works, in Nietzsche's lives. Yes, Polish and Russian were two European languages in which Nietzsche, main works of Nietzsche, into which main works of Nietzsche were translated. Yes, and such Polish poets like Wacław Berendt and Leopold Staff, very important for Polish poetry, that they managed to do it. It is the very important moment. Yes, and in fact, it is also, I think that also quite unknown to Polish, not only Polish people but also Polish philosophers, phenomenon of a very early reception of Nietzsche in Polish intellectual life and intellectual culture. But in fact, as you can see, at the time when, for example, Hegel lived or Schelling lived, we didn't have a systematic work on translation, a systematic attempts to translate their main philosophical works. We have got only some few translations of different few texts written in German, important for the philosophy of the time. But we have got, and it is also something important, many attempts to present to Polish reader the ideas formulated in these works. They are not translations, but they are presentations. For example, Bronisław Trentowski, who is probably the most important representative of the Polish national philosophy of the Romantic period, wrote several texts in which he tries to present to his readers, for example, first of all, the ideas of Schelling, and of Schelling's in the time when Schelling conducted his lectures in Berlin at the beginning of 1840s, of course. He presented main philosophical ideas of Schelling, and he did it in different texts which he wrote at that time. Yes, so it is something like this, I think. Translations are not so important, but presentations of different ideas formulated by different philosophers of that time, yes?
That's very interesting, because I suppose that's just a different way of trying to, I mean, we maybe don't call it translation in the strict sense, but to translate the ideas in some sense into Polish for Polish audiences. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit, either of you, about how this reflects changing preoccupations of philosophically inclined Polish readers through the 19th century, from this sort of early concern with the sort of late Enlightenment ideas and what you were saying about the importance of the Polish language to sort of national culture and the like, into Nietzsche later on.
At the beginning of 19th century, Polish intellectual culture, for Polish intellectuals, they clearly changed the main point of reference. Point of reference for the representatives of Polish Enlightenment were, first of all, taken from France. And after that, these main points of reference were taken from Germany, of course. And we have got one very interesting exception. This very interesting exception is Jan Śniadecki, who is the most important representative of Polish Enlightenment, who tried to not only I think that he tried to defend Polish culture from the influences of Romanticism, and he was engaged in a kind of a battle with early Romantics. And his late works, he referred mainly to the British philosophy of common sense, not to the French philosophy. But he's a very interesting person, because he, while discussing with early Romantics, he also get a kind of a self-critical knowledge of his own cultural formation of the Polish Enlightenment, and he tried to somehow change this main point of reference to change it from France to Great Britain and to British philosophy of common sense. It was the main point of reference for this philosopher of Polish Enlightenment.
Fantastic. So, I mean, we've got so many of these interesting points of culture with the very early stages that you were talking about, Jakub, with an international Latin and Neo-Latin scholarly world, with French Enlightenment ideas, with German idealism, common sense from England. And I was just wondering if either of you would want to say a little bit more about generally the way that the philosophical vocabulary of Polish develops at this time, either by contact with these other languages, with any borrowings that we have, or with self-conscious reflection on the use of particular terms and their sort of development and refinement.
You see, I think that when we are speaking about this, we can first of all note that for Polish philosophers of the time, there were two main sources to which we can, from which we can get our own philosophical language. The first source is, of course, the political literature of the First Polish Republic.
Yes.
For example, this notion by which Mochnacki translated German Selbstbewusstsein is clearly taken by him from Piotr Skarga, for example. He refers, for example, to Piotr Skarga and also to other representatives of the Polish political philosophy of the First Polish Republic. But the most important and the most common source for all of these philosophers of Polish Romanticism, never mind many differences between them, was just the common language of Polish people. And both for Mickiewicz, who directly referred also to the ideas of these Polish people, and not only to the way in which they use language, and for Trentowski, who was a rationalist and who tried to construct Polish philosophical language. The main point of reference in this specific case, in the case of how we should use the language to construct Polish original philosophical language, was the way in which it was used by a Polish people. Yes, and Trentowski tried. He's the most important person from this point of view, because he tried to give Polish words that are going to translate this German or Latin or Greek or French words. He tried to construct many. He constructed many different neologisms, which sounds strange also for contemporary Polish readers.
Yes.
But neologisms which were supposed to translate through not only Polish sounding words, but also through the way in which Polish people construct these words, try to translate the notions, the concepts taken from other languages.
Yes, and I think that Trentowski is a figure who fits very well into this division you mentioned earlier when we spoke of early Polish philosophical vocabulary. He would fit perfectly into the division between strategies of assimilation and exotization, or of calquing foreign terms and inventing new, because he was radical representative of the strategy of coining terms, even to the point at which you start to sort of modify your own language. So he's an inventor of many words. Some of them survived and entered like normal language, like świadomość. Yeah.
Jaźń.
Yeah, and jaźń. Świadomość maybe.
It was used, but the word świadomość was used in previous Polish, but it get a new sense that was formulated by Trentowski.
Yeah, and jaźń was original invention of Trentowski, meaning the self. Yeah, it's the self. It's the self, although it's it has the root ja, which is me. So it's like le moi, or like Ichheit. Yeah, I think you could translate it into German as Ichheit, and it's a very successful word and also beautifully sounding. So like I think that it was also popular among some poets and writers of the Young Poland, those who translated Nietzsche, because Young Poland was a cultural movement which was sort of a post-romanticism linked to like new reception of Polish romanticism from like from the 1830s, 1840s, and influences of European symbolicism and perhaps philosophy of life. So they also used all such concepts, wrote, for instance, perhaps some metaphysical poetry, and this fitted into it very well in a slightly different political and intellectual context. Yes.
I'm fascinated by this idea that they were taking.
20th century.
Sure.
20th century.
I'm really interested by this idea that they're taking very seriously the ordinary usage of people, of peasants, of non-expert speakers of a language. But I wondered whether there was a bit of a tension, and if so, you could explain the difference between taking very seriously ordinary speech, which sounds like something that anticipates sort of, think about these people, they're like Austin and Ryle, ordinary language philosophers. But they're, as far as I understand it, if you're also coining new neologisms that are going to explain philosophical concepts, you're not simply proposing that we do philosophy ourselves as the common people do, but that we use that we use ordinary language in some way. So could you explain how they understand
the significance? Yes, of course, and it is very important, because in fact you are referring to a really crucial point. Yes. This is what we can get from the common ordinary people. It's not the way in which they understand different words and different concepts and so on, but we can get from them only the way in which they use the language. They construct words, and this is the most important way. So we are getting a kind of a method, not a kind of an understanding. Yes. And of course, this is, and I think that this is a kind of a division that clearly manifests what is the most important thing in it.
Yes, because it's a dynamic construction. So it's not a philosopher looking at ordinary language as a domain from which he draws like philosophical insights, but it's a dynamic construction.
According to Rentowski, of course.
Rentowski and also Libet, perhaps. And like, let's say, Polish national philosophy at large, it's a dynamic construct, and the philosopher is engaged with the public, with like ordinary people, in order to draw like linguistic resources from them and transform it intellectually to draw like a new meaning into language, in a sort of feedback loop in which the like the people are transformed into a nation, into a cultural unity. So that it is not purely intellectual endeavor. It is a intellectual and political endeavor. This is also actually sort of heritage of early modern Polish republicanists, of the Polish nobles, for whom, so to say, the intellectual life and political life were inseparable. And for that reason, they were very, very much preoccupied political and practical philosophy. Ethics were inseparable from politics, and thinking were inseparable from politics and rhetorics. So that you had this tradition withheld, although raised or reappearing in a speculative, in a form of speculative philosophy, which has as ultimately political goals, which are also perhaps to some extent theological, yes? Because a nation is understood as perhaps a sort of eschatological unit, a part of history, like a a self-determined, autonomous participant of the historical progress, which is understood eschatologically, and which requires like participation in nation or as nation, because it's not a matter of individuals.
Yes. And I think that during our discussion, we should also refer, and we cannot omit this fact, to the probably most important word which was constructed in Polish language, and which is now used also outside Poland and outside Russia, these two different countries, which is the motherland, which are the mother or fatherlands of this word. It means the word inteligencja. And this word, of course, you know from English. Yes, of course, you know it as the word probably which points out at, which points at the a part of a society which is quite specific or for Poland and for Russia of 19th century. And it was, of course, the word which was constructed by two Polish philosophers already mentioned, Karol Libet and Bronisław Trentowski. And this word was aimed just to define the, first of all, to define the part of society which is leading because of because of the fact that it is educated in different fields. And it was also the idea which is deeply inscribed in this word is the egalitarian idea, first of all, of Libet, according to which we cannot point out different political classes of society, because we should love the nation as the whole. And the intelligentsia is not, for example, a nobility or a middle class, because of the fact that it is a part of society which comes from different classes, but for which it is the definition of which is first of all linked to the kind of an ethos, attitude towards society, which is first of all connected with the love for the whole nation. Yes, so it is a kind of a part of society which is a leading one, not a ruling one. And the idea of this concept of this notion is to point out or point at this as this part of society which will be the leading part of this society, but it leads this society to a moment in which whole of the society will become a kind of an intelligentsia. Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And attain historical self-consciousness, perhaps.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it's so interesting to have an account not only of a philosophical tradition about which I think many people in the Anglophone world are not very aware, but also one which has been reflecting so much at so many different points on the significance of language to philosophy, and not, I suppose, of the significance of language with a capital L, to philosophy, but of a particular language to philosophy, to its particular political significance for a nation which also has a very political, national political as well as intellectual history, and also on the insistence on the significance of ordinary usage in a way that really presages that. I will thank both of our guests for their time and their expertise today. Thank you very much, Jakub. Thank you very much, Tomasz.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you next time.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.